Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural conference of LIT Lab, Law and Information Technologies Laboratory. We are very pleased to welcome you as well as Professor Xavier Oberson as our speaker today. Before we begin, as is usual with these virtual meetings, I would like to clarify some organizational details. We have all closed your microphones. Basically, you cannot turn them on. If you would like us to turn your microphone on, please write us via the chat or raise your hand, and our team is going to take care of that. If you have any questions, please write them down through the chat, and I'm going to ask them to Professor Oberson after the end of the conference. Now, I would like to give some brief information about our laboratory. It is a joint effort of three faculties: Faculty of Management, Faculty of Engineering and Natural Sciences, and Faculty of Law. We have been established 2 months ago, approximately, and we aim to conduct research in fields that combine law and information technologies as well as engineering, because as you all know, we cannot exist without interdisciplinary research. At this stage, it's extremely important for lawyers to be able to collaborate with information technologies, engineering, with other fields as well, such as psychology or sociology, and the same holds true for the other fields. To that end, we will be conducting research projects with governmental institutions or private institutions. We have training programs, dedicated training and educational programs for the interested parties, and we are also actively undertaking legal design activities. We have a team from different faculties. We are currently 10 people. I would like to thank them all by this opportunity, and especially to our vice coordinator, Çağrı Mardin, for all his help. I'm very proud to be the coordinator of the laboratory. And without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to the rector of our university, Professor Sondan Durkanoğlu Feyiz, for a few words about the laboratory. Professor.
Thank you, Alara. I'm very pleased to see that three schools, School of Law, School of Engineering, and School of Management, came together and create this lab. You know, one of the main goals in our strategic plan is that to create such an environment in which people from different backgrounds, from different disciplines can come together, work together. And this specific lab is specifically helps in creating such an environment. And I'm sure several people from several departments will come together, and this lab will create the environment to write many joint proposals and, of course, writing many joint research papers. So I'm very happy to see this, and I thank all of the ones who make this happen. So I also thank you, Professor Oberson, for being part of this event. Thank you. And so I leave the floor to Nihat Hoca, or which one, Alara?
Professor Berken, Nihat Hoca,
okay. Yes.
who is also our vice rector and the dean of Faculty of Engineering and Natural Sciences, and a member of the advisory board of the laboratory. Professor, please.
Well, I'm very happy to be in this laboratory, in this enterprise, because after all, life and the world is a laboratory. It's the only real laboratory. The other one are fake ones, are kind of simulations. We all live in the real laboratory of life, and the language of that laboratory is law. The moment you get up, law starts functioning. Even when you're sleeping, the law starts functioning. So the language is a lab, and the algorithms are mathematical, are scientific, as our rector stressed as we teach in our first-year students. So this is a perfect combination, a three-way marriage of the real-life laboratory, the language of that laboratory law, and the algorithms of those laboratories, which are mathematical. So I'm very happy to be here in this mathematical science, which is law, and representing our faculty. Also, I believe, to my knowledge, this is a unique enterprise. We've all been around the world. This unique enterprise, a unique opportunity to present both our customers, which are the students, and our research associates. So I can talk forever, obviously, but I thank our rector for supporting this enterprise, and I thank our dean, Başak Baysal, from the School of Law, for spearheading and beginning this enterprise. I'm very thankful, and I consider myself very lucky to be in this enterprise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Now I would like to pass the virtual microphone to the Vice Rector of our university, who is in charge of research and development and also head of Department of Management Information Systems, Professor Hasan Da. Please, Professor.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you very much for attending to this such a unique conference. Well, up until a couple of years ago, we didn't have blockchain or smart contracts in our life. We did have contracts, legally binding contracts, but we didn't have this approach. And we didn't have cryptocurrencies. And we definitely did not have, 10 or 15 years ago, artificial intelligence or GDPR forcing the way we do our business or the way we manage our daily life or research or, every type of business. So usually, to my belief, law usually comes behind the technology. So the pace of technology is much faster than the law because you cannot foresee, what kind of criminality or wrong actions will be taking place in the future so that you can create law to prevent it. So usually we learn an event occurs, then we enact a law or something. So in this regard, to manage our business life in the world, to go on with our lives, we need to have such a unique combination of engineering, management, and law come together, to make our life easier. So in that respect, I thank to our rector for supporting this initiative, and then I sincerely thank our dean Başak Baysal, also pushing this forward, because now it is not unusual to have one artificial intelligence supported robot in this meeting. So assuming, if that robot causes something, is there any law, to deal with that event? No. So we hope to to tackle a lot of different problems we might encounter in the future with the help of this lab. So in this regard, I find this opportunity very exciting, and I'm excited to be part of it. And I will try to put all of my efforts into this lab for different kind of research activities. In that respect, I'd like to thank our rector for supporting, to our dean for such a unique team. And of course, I thank you, Alara Hoca, for her tireless efforts to bring us all together to make this lab happen. Thank you all, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, Professor. And finally, before our conference, Taxing Robots, I would like to leave the floor to the Dean of our Faculty of Law, Professor Başak Baysal.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Yazıcıoğlu. As the Dean of the Faculty, it is really my great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural conference of the LIT Lab, Kadir Has University Law and Information Technology Laboratory. And I'm very proud to announce that this important project is a very big consequence of a fruitful cooperation between three faculties: Faculty of Law, Faculty of Management, Faculty of Engineering, and Natural Sciences. And it will be a thank speech. I have too many persons to thank. I'm sorry from the beginning if I forgot somebody. But I would like to thank all the members of the university who greatly helped in the establishment of the LIT Lab and in organizing this conference, especially the president of our university, Professor Sondan Durkanoğlu Feyiz, our coordinator of the LIT Lab, Alara Yazıcıoğlu, Professor Yazıcıoğlu, and our Vice President, Vice Rector, Professor Hassan Da, great friend of Faculty of Law. Personally, I have a special thanks, and it's not an Oscar speech, but I have a special thanks. I feel that I'm grateful to Professor Nihat Berker, who have made available to all of us his enormous experience of organization and administration for the creation of this amazing project. I'm very, very happy and excited about that. And I don't know if he's here. I would like to thank also Mr. Tuğrul Sevim, a partner at BTS law firm, who has kindly supported this project from the very beginning. I'm sure in the future we will continue to collaborate in the other fields of law with him. And last but definitely not least, I would like to thank Professor Xavier Oberson, who accepted our conference invitation about the stimulating topic, taxing robots. But being a good francophone means to say a few words in French also. Si vous me permettez, please let me express my sincere appreciation en français, professeur. Cher professeur et cher ami, maintenant, permettez-moi de dire cher ami, monsieur. Comme vous le savez, la Turquie et la Suisse ont un lien historique important, le Code civil suisse. La réception du Code civil et des obligations suisses est l'une des étapes la plus importantes de la révolution kémaliste. Alors, nous partageons avec nos collègues suisses un monde et une compréhension juridique commun. Pour cela, c'est toujours un grand plaisir pour nous de faire la connaissance et de discuter avec un juriste suisse, et surtout si ce juriste est un professeur exceptionnel dans son domaine, comme vous. Et j'espère que nous allons continuer notre coopération entre nos institutions. Encore un grand merci et j'ai hâte de vous rencontrer personnellement en vous accueillant ici à Istanbul. J'espère très bientôt. I wish you all a fruitful conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now, without further ado, I think we can begin to our conference, Taxing Robots. Prior to that, I would like to say a few words about Professor Oberson, who is here with us today. He does not need much introduction, but I still would like to remind that he is a professor of tax law at the University of Geneva, and he's also attorney at law and a partner at the law firm Oberson Abels. On a more personal note, he's my PhD supervisor, and he also taught me almost everything I know about taxation, so I'm very grateful to him, and I would like to thank him both personally and on behalf of LeadLab to be here to support us today. Now, Professor, I will leave the floor to you, and I will be uploading the slides. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alara. So I'm really touched by all your very warm welcome and very nice word that you told me. I really like to pass my deep honor and appreciation to be able to participate to this event. I would like to thank the Khas University, the Little Lab, and I hope really that, as you said, Dean, that we could maybe meet. Hopefully, I would love to be able to go to Istanbul, but as Alara knows, Istanbul is a very dear city in my heart. I went there very often. It's one of the most beautiful cities in the world, I personally think. I remember there were some very nice jazz clubs also at the time, because you may know that I'm also a big fan of music. So I really like to keep this link also in the future, that we can continue to analyze all this interesting topic, and as you do it in a sort of interdisciplinary fashion. So I would like to make a little presentation about taxing robots. Let's say in a few years ago, when we started to discuss about this idea, it was very controversial. It still is, of course, but I must say the situation has really evolved. There are more and more people thinking about it, analyzing it, sometimes in a very critical perspective, but the situation has really changed if I compare to the situation that existed, for example, like 4 years ago. I made a conference in Geneva. It was early 2017, and it was very, very aggressive. I even received some personal comments, but in a very aggressive way, while other people were very enthusiastic. But so it shows that it is a very sensitive topic, in fact, maybe because, as you will see, we are in fact discussing what is a human being, what is a robot, what is the distinction between the two. And in a way, if you think about this topic, even from a philosophical perspective, it can go very far, actually. And this is why I think it's also very sensible. So first of all, I would like to say that start with the development of artificial intelligence. I mean, you know that better than I do. There's a huge development of artificial intelligence in the world, and the idea to use robots is absolutely not new. We were using robots since decades, but I must say mostly for at least in a first stage in the industrial sector. So we were using industrial robots, for example, in the car industry. If you visit today a factory of cars, you will see that roughly 80% of the production of cars is done by robots. The same for shoes, for, let's say, really industrial consumer goods, television, etc. The problematic aspect is that more and more we are also using robots in the service economy. So you see doctors, for example, there's a company called Da Vinci, which is doing robots for surgery. It's not a surgeon yet, but it's very helpful for surgery. You see robot bankers, we call them the robot advisor, for example. Even in entertainment, slowly you see the use of robots. Lawyers even. In America, for example, they use a computer called ROS. And ROS is a robot, it's in a computer, but it's specialized in legal research. And ironically, actually, you will be surprised to learn that the specialty of this robot is bankruptcy law. I think it's a bit ironic if you think that eventually it could replace all lawyers. You see robots in the administration. For example, in Tokyo, I could see a sort of small robot that was a project designed to help the tax administration. For example, you could go to see the robot, and the robot would even help you with his eyes to show you how to fill a tax return, to show you information. I mean, very helpful device. And of course, also in agriculture. In any way, I mean, in any area of the economy, you can more and more imagine the use of robots. Now, this is not a bad, of course, development. So I'm not against innovation at all. On the contrary, I think robots are very helpful. In fact, they can replace very boring activities, sometimes even very dangerous activities. If you think about Fukushima in Japan, now some robots are going into the sea to check the level of radioactivity in the sea. So I don't think there are many human beings that would love to go in the sea to do this job. So it's not as such bad, and on the contrary, the robot can be very helpful. But the problem that we have to tackle is the impact of this growing use of robots and artificial intelligence on the labor market. And this is, of course, a question that many people have raised. You have controversial views on that. You have economic analysis on many different, with many different conclusions. But I must say, maybe in a summarized fashion, we can divide this analysis on the consequences of the use of robots into two different categories. you have the optimist on the one hand and the pessimist on the other hand. So the optimist, and I can say, I think currently this is the majority view. The optimists, they say, there's no problem with the growing use of robots. It's the fourth industrial revolution. We already have experienced 3 industrial revolution. And of course, some jobs were destroyed, but many additional jobs were created. And at the end of the day, there were even more jobs than before. And the economy kept growing and the welfare of the people kept growing. So this is the 4th industrial revolution, and we should be, at the end of the day, better off like we were in the first revolution. This optimist view is also some kind of approach similar to a Schumpeter point of view, which is the view of what he calls destructive, constructive destruction. So you destroy some jobs, but there are more jobs at the end of the day which are created. So this is the optimist view. On the other side, you have the pessimist. So the pessimist, and you also have very prominent economists on that side, they say, well, this time it is different. This famous quote, this time it's different. So why is it different this time? Because we are talking about artificial intelligence. So we are talking about some device, some robots, some computer program, some algorithms that eventually could replace in the future any kind of jobs, because we are now focusing on the intelligence of the people and not only on the arms, like a car replacing a dog, like a train replacing many cars, etc. So eventually, in a way, even labor could disappear if we go very far in this pessimistic view. Okay, so personally, I'm not, let's say, I don't have the competence to tell you who is right and who is wrong among the optimist or the pessimist. But what we can say and what we see already is that many jobs will disappear. This is inevitable, and we can see that already. The big question is that will enough new jobs appear to replace the others? We don't know. And what we also know is that many people will not have the possibility to adjust in a sufficient time, because this transition, I mean, this change of economy could occur very quickly, very rapidly. And some people even say that the pandemic of the coronavirus that we see could also increase the use of robots and of artificial intelligence, because these are machines that are not affected at all by any pandemic risk. So at least you have 2 considerations. First of all, it's quite sure that many people will lose their jobs. And secondly, it's also very probable that not all the people that lost their job will have the possibility to adjust and to find a new one. So if we take this perspective, then we need to think about solutions, because if the pessimists are right, we can be in a very big trouble eventually, because at least what I call a triple negative effect could occur. First of all, you will have a loss of income, because if you lose your job, you don't have a salary, and the salary, as we all know, is a very important base of income tax in all countries around the world. If you take the case of the United States, for example, by far the biggest resource of income comes from the taxation of labor. It's a very important percentage of the resource. The second negative effect is that At the same time, the social security system will lose the revenues coming from salary, but it will need additional funds to pay, let's say, unemployment pensions to the workers that would have lost their jobs. And this effect would even be compounded by the first. So the first two effects will increase together. And then there's a third aspect that is not always mentioned, is that also a diminution of consumption, because if a worker is losing his or her job, she has no more salary, and as a consequence, she or he cannot consume, cannot buy goods. So this is also very problematic as a whole for the economy. So I'm not saying that this free effect will occur. I'm just saying that there's a risk that some of these effects, in some percentage at least, will occur. And that's why I think, personally, we need to think about solution right now. And one solution, as I will try to demonstrate, could be to tax robots. Why do we need to think about it now? Because as we know, it takes years, it can take even decades to keep and to find a consensus globally on such a concept of taxing robots. If you look at what is going on right now at the OECD, on the taxation of service, of digital services, the so-called Pillar 1, the Pillar 2, the countries have been negotiating since at least 2015. So it's already almost 6 years from now, and still we are far from a global consensus, even though we hope to get something in June this year. So it took at least 6 years already to find a consensus. So you can imagine that finding a consensus on such an idea of a global tax on robots would take. So this is why I really personally think we should start to think about this idea right now, open the debate, see the problems that occur, because there are many legal problems and economic problems linked with such an approach. Because again, if the pessimists are right, then it might be too late to adjust and to find a consensus. So now, how do we implement, how do we design such a tax on robots? What is interesting is that in parallel to this analysis, some institutions and some countries, including the EU, have started to develop analysis, a legal analysis on the concept, on the legal concept of robots. And in a report, very interesting report of February 2017 from the EU Parliament, the idea to grant some kind of new personality to some kind of robot has started to emerge. So in this report, they focus more on the civil law aspect. And one of the concerns was to maybe develop some kind of civil liability for some damages caused by specific robots. And in this concept, the idea of taxing robots was also mentioned, but it was rejected at the end. Estonia has also created a group of analysis to consider maybe a legal personality of robots. The problem is that it's difficult to define. Many of the opponents of a robot tax are really focusing on that aspect, and they say, we may discuss about it later on, but they say this concept of a tax on robot doesn't make any sense because there's no way you can define a robot. And I completely disagree with that, because we've been confronted with something like that already in the past. If you think about 100 years ago, okay? 100 years ago, maybe even more, the concept of a corporation, for example, a concept of corporation didn't exist. You had human beings as legal persons, but the idea to grant the legal personality to a corporation under specific criteria didn't exist. And if you think about it today, nobody in the legal world would challenge the idea that a corporation, under specific criteria defined by the legislator, is a legal entity. And a corporation can, has a name, has a brand. A corporation can go to court, it can sue somebody, it can be sued. And in some countries, a corporation can even have a criminal liability and can even have specific constitutional rights. So today, nobody would challenge this idea that a corporation has a personality, a legal personality. Why couldn't we consider today, under some specific criteria, that some type of robots, I'm thinking mostly on what we call smart robots, so robots with some artificial intelligence, the possibility, some autonomy, the criteria of autonomy is very important. Perhaps the time has come to consider a legal entity of some type of robots. This would help the government maybe to control them better, to be able to sue some kind of robots creating damages. And of course, it would maybe follow as an idea that then a robot could be subject as such to tax. But we are now faced with the problem of designing the robot tax. Because even if we could come with a definition or a legal definition of a robot as a legal entity, we still need to justify a tax on robots. And in order to justify a tax on robot, you need at least to have an economic justification, because you introduce a new tax. So why do you do that? You should have a justification. So first of all, an economic justification of a tax on robots, and you need a second justification, the constitutional justification. In particular, you need to justify some kind of ability to pay on robots. So first of all, the economic justification. Well, in Switzerland, we have a tax, which is a very controversial tax, which is a tax on what we call the rental value of home owners, okay? So if you own an apartment, a flat in Geneva, or a flat or a house in Switzerland, even if you don't receive any income, you will be subject to an income tax on the so-called rental value of your apartment. In other words, the tax administration will justify an economic income which corresponds to the rent that you should have paid in order to be in this apartment. This is an economic definition of income. So if you take this perspective, which has been, by the way, accepted by the Supreme Court also, you could make the following case. And you could say, okay, you have an enterprise, a corporation, you are replacing human workers by robots. In a way, you are saving the salary that you should have paid to the humans by replacing them by robots. Isn't that some kind of economic income that you are getting by using a robot instead of a human? So arguably, at least this is the perspective I defend, you could make an economic justification of a robot tax based on that analogy with the rental value of a house. Another perspective, which has been also justified by some American scholars, they took the position of some kind of neutrality between a robot and a human. So they say we should treat both neutrally from an economic perspective. So at least, I know it's controversial, but at least you can make an economic justification of taxing robots. Then comes the, I would say, the most difficult part, in my view. This is the constitutional perspective, and how can you justify a tax on robots based on the most important principle of tax law, which is the ability to pay principle. It is a requirement of a constitutional law. The problem of that is because today, a robot as such doesn't have a legal personality. And even more than that, as such, a robot doesn't have any ability to pay. After all, a robot has no money. The robot cannot pay you for a service. The robot doesn't receive any income. So as such, but I mean today, a robot doesn't have any ability to pay. This is not to say that it will never happen. In the future, if, for example, the works on the EU Parliament start to evolve, maybe they will start to grant the legal personality to some kind of robots, and maybe even they might allocate some kind of economic ability to some kind of robots. This is not impossible. Again, if you make the comparison with the corporation as such, 100 years ago, didn't exist. Corporation didn't have neither a legal capacity, neither any income. Well, today, you create a corporation, for example, a société anonyme in Swiss law, you need to have a share capital of minimum 100,000 Swiss francs. So you have the legal entity and you have some kind of financial capacity. You have, in other words, an ability to pay. So this could happen in the future. We could grant some kind of ability to pay, but this is, of course, a very futuristic and revolutionary perspective of tax law. So this is why, in my view, I recommend to have an approach in two different stages. Okay, the first stage would be to say, okay, so far we do not recognize that robots have as such an ability to pay. So we are going to focus on taxing the use of robots in a first stage. But in a second stage, a more futuristic approach could even be to grant this ability to pay to robot, and then we could consider taxing robots as such. So some kind of a potential solution I could describe of this approach. So the first, of course, idea is to tax enterprise using robots. So this is, let's say, the so-called first stage. So this idea would be to introduce a profit tax on enterprise which uses robots instead of human beings. There have already been various ideas that have been developed, and personally, what I defend in a way, what I argue is to introduce, in analogy with the Swiss rental value tax, so the tax on the imputed rent for owners, would be to tax what we call an imputed salary of robot activities. So this concept would be to say the company is making an economic profit by using a robot instead of a human workers because it doesn't have to pay the salary. So we could try, at least reasonably, to define some kind of equivalent salary that the enterprise would have paid for this kind of job done by robots. We could work also with lump sum approaches. There are various possibilities to implement that. An interesting approach is the approach implemented by South Korea. Some people say that South Korea has introduced the first robot tax, this is not really, this is not exactly true, but what South Korea has implemented is an indirect approach by creating more strict limitation of deduction in favor of robotics. You could also consider what some people call automation taxes. It can be general or special. So an automation taxes would be a tax, again, always on enterprise using robots, where you would make some kind of ratio. You compare the amount of human workers with some data of the enterprise. For example, you make a ratio between the number of human worker vis-a-vis the sales, or human worker vis-a-vis the net profit. There's two American scholars have suggested this approach recently in an article. I think, yes, this is Abbott and Bogerschneider, so two legal scholars in America. In an article, they advocate, I mean, at least they suggested this kind of automation tax. Interestingly enough, in Geneva, there was a proposal from the Socialist Party a few years ago, 2 years ago, to introduce a special automation tax in Geneva for vending machines in the shops. So they would implement a tax on the vending machine, and it is the same concept, because they said this vending machine is replacing vendors, let's say human vendors, and therefore the shop could be subject to tax. So I call this tax a special automation tax, because it taxes the automation, but just for a very narrow group of activities. This is, in this case, vending machine. Personally, by the way, I've been consulted for this proposal, but I'm not so much in favor of it, because this created problem for equality of treatment. Namely, why do you subject to tax only vending machine and not other automation activities in other sectors? So I think if you go towards the idea of taxing robots, you should also comply with the principle of equality of treatment. And then the last approach that you could consider always in this idea of taxing the use of robots is what we call Pigouvian taxes. So Pigouvian taxes are more not so much taxes focusing on the raising revenue, but these are more taxes in order to compensate for what we call externalities. The main example, of course, is a pollution tax. You tax the pollution, you want to reduce the pollution, you want to compensate the externality, namely the pollution created by polluters. So you could consider also a robot tax from this perspective. And there's one prominent proponent of this approach, which is Professor Schiller, who is a former Nobel Prize, and he suggested a transitory robot tax just to help the transition toward the new economy with a Pigouvian perspective. So this was a very interesting approach, I think. Now, this is the second stage. So the second stage would be to say, okay, now we have gone a bit further. The legislator has introduced some type of legal personality for some types of robots. And then we could consider taxing robots as such, because in that case, robots could even have some kind of ability to pay. So if you go that way, then you can even introduce some kind of income, if I may call it that way, income tax on robots. And of course, this we are talking in the future, but in the future, you can then imagine a robot with an electronic approach that will be automatically subject to tax on the streams of funds or income that would go through the machine. You can even introduce a capital tax. I don't think it would make so much sense, but many things are possible in this respect. And in the same approach, you already have, it exists already in some states, some object tax on robots. So this is more an old-fashioned view of tax, like a tax on cars, like a tax on animals. It was very funny because in Geneva we had a referendum on the tax on dogs. So people were complaining about tax on dogs, and people said, this is again equality of treatment because we don't have tax on cats, you know. So you could have the similar approach and say, well, a robot as such or a machine could be subject to this type of tax. It exists, for example, in California. You already have some object tax, like a fee, in a way, on drones and on self-driving cars. This is, my view, this is an interesting approach, of course, but it's a very old-fashioned view of taxing robots, because in this perspective, you consider robots like an object, like a machine, like a car. And I believe that we should go much further in this perspective and consider robots in a more dynamic way and introduce better taxes on the flows of income, the flows of funds that are going through the robot. But as you see from this presentation, this is not easy, but there are some various possibilities. There's also another approach, which to me is very interesting, and it's probably one of the most promising one in my perspective, which is the value-added tax. Because first of all, it is a bit provocative, but in a way, we already tax robots under the value-added tax already today. Because when, for example, you are buying a car, you buy a car, the sale of the car is subject to value-added tax, clearly. In the price of the good, the consumption price of the car, inside this price, you have the cost of using automation, of using the robots that have in the industrial and the production of the car. You are paying for the cost of that use of robot already. If you have you are using a bank, and asset management is also subject generally to value-added tax, not loans, but asset management. If the manager is using a robot advisor, in the fee that he will charge you for the services, this will include some part of services rendered by robots. So in a way, already today, we are taxing robots by the value-added tax. But we could go a bit further, and to go this further would be to consider eventually that robots are taxable person for the value-added tax. And you already have very interesting jurisprudence in the, for example, in the EU Court of Justice on the concept of permanent establishment. And there was some cases, some recent cases where the court even considered that some kind of automatic machine could, under some condition, be regarded as permanent establishment. So we are not very far, even from a jurisprudence and legal perspective, to consider under some condition that a robot could be a taxable person from the value-added tax perspective. And if this consequence would occur, then we can imagine that the robot could automatically charge VAT on the supply of goods, could charge value-added tax on the services rendered, and it could even credit automatically the value-added tax, the input value-added tax on the service received in order to effectuate any kind of a transaction. I know it's a bit science fiction what I'm saying, but this is legally feasible in my view. The fourth possibility is social security. This is probably the most crucial one for some countries, because if really the amount of workers start to disappear, we have a huge problem of funding the social security, because social security is really levied on the contribution from salary. So we could introduce a contribution to social security on the use of robots, for example. And the last possibility, which is not very important, but just from a conceptual standpoint, is to introduce a fee for the use of robots, but this will not raise, of course, a lot of income, of revenue for the state. And then there are some alternative solutions. So I must say there have been recently very critical articles on the taxation of robots. I'm quite aware of the criticism. Some people say, first of all, it's not possible to define a robot. Others are saying you are against innovation when you want to tax robots. Personally, I don't believe that, because when you tax intellectual property, everybody agrees to tax intellectual property. If you find a new hit on the radio, nobody will complain that you will have to be subject to tax on the royalty that you receive. This is not saying that you are against the culture. This is not saying that you are against innovation. So why cannot you tax automation and robots? Doesn't mean that you are against robots. So me, this argument doesn't make so much sense, but it is a very important one. So under this kind of criticism, some scholars are suggesting alternative approach than taxing robots. So one alternative is to increase the tax on capital income. It is true, and it's well known today that salaries are very highly taxed in comparison with capital income. There's a big difference into the two. In most countries, I think this is true. Another solution which is also proposed is to say, instead of taxing robots, why don't you just increase the profit tax of corporations? After all, corporations are using robots, they are making profit out of it, and then you can just get this solution by taxing companies. I agree with that, but still, I think that this approach doesn't really tackle as such the issue of the fact that robots are replacing human workers. And the last approach is the taxation of the digital economy, which could be some kind of indirect way of taxing robots. Because, for example, if you look at the OECD proposal right now, they would tax this so-called tech giant, the GAFA, as we call them. And it's true that these multinational companies use a lot of algorithms which help them to get a lot of data that they can then use for advertisement purposes, etc. So this is some kind of indirect way to tax artificial intelligence. But the last point I want to make is that in any event, if we were to find some kind of consensus and some ideas that would be feasible in order to introduce the taxation of robots, we would need an international framework, because it could be dangerous for one single state to say, I introduce a taxation of robots without having, let's say, other countries to follow a kind of similar path. So probably an analysis from the OECD, from the UN, the EU is already analyzing it, would make sense. And what I can say also is that, as I described before, this issue is closely linked to the taxation of the digital economy. But unfortunately, if you look at the very complex reports that have been published recently in so-called Pillar 1, so-called Pillar 2, they don't really they don't really analyze the taxation of robots, which to me is a bit, it's a bit a pity, because it would have been a big opportunity to start to think about this idea. And then it will need a lot of analysis, because it would change even the way maybe we characterize income. We would need to tackle the issue of a permanent establishment. For example, does the robot create a permanent establishment? And of course, transfer pricing, because transaction between robots and human, is it based on the so-called arm's length principle? All these fascinating issues are really worth to be studied a bit further. But as a conclusion, I would like to say the following, and just finish by a warning, because we need to be careful, because maybe one day, if we introduce such taxes, maybe one day the robot could even refuse to pay their taxes. And we could be in a big trouble this day, because even worse, the robots could force us to pay their taxes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Oberson, for this excellent presentation on a very controversial issue. Thank you very much. Now I would like to open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, please either raise your hand or write them through the chat so I can ask them to Professor Oberson. Professor Berker, please.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk. Je vous remercie beaucoup moi-même. Je suis un peu francophone. Merci beaucoup pour être à Istanbul, pour nous aimer. On va se voir assez souvent, je l'espère. Yes, so let me ask my question. Now, this is a naive question. There has always been human labor saving machines or human labor saving apparatuses over the years. For example, when I was a student, when you went to a parking lot, there was a person at the gate, and he or she checked your ID and let you in. Nowadays, you go to a gate and there's a card reader that reads the card and you go in. So there is a little machine there. It's not a robot, but it has replaced human labor. So based on these arguments, I would naively take that every human labor replacing machine should be taxed then, if we have to go in that way. What would you say? What do you think about this?
Yes, absolutely. It's one of the objections sometimes that some people make against taxing robots, because they say, first of all, this is not new, exactly as you say. This is not new. Or you had the train replacing horses, you know, yeah. And then all the taxi driver replace all the horses. And maybe then the taxi driver eventually will be replaced by self-driving cars.
Yes.
So this is a evolution, a general evolution of the economy. So why now suddenly we say we are going to tax the robots? Absolutely, this is a very good point that you raised. The problem is that now the scale becomes so broad that it creates a very big risk for the economy. So, of course, you need to put, let's say, the limit. So maybe one day we could even go as far as you say every machine that replaces a human would be subject to tax. But so far, we focus at least on some kind of concept, which would be a concept of what we call a smart robot. Because then you have a machine which is getting closer to a human being, because he has some kind of artificial intelligence. So this is where you draw the limit. But you are absolutely right. One day, the question of where you draw the limit will have to be solved. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat section that I would like to read. Do you think that taxation on robots will succeed without a universal basic income program? Basically, the companies are going to pay this tax and then pass them on to the consumers. That is the main issue of the participants that is expressed here. So do we need at the same time a universal basic income program along with the tax on robots?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is also a very interesting question. Yeah. Many people have made the link between the universal basic and unconditional income and the robot tax. I must say, in my view, these are two different issues, but there's a link, of course. But the robot tax focuses on the raising of revenues. So it brings revenues to the state. And the state will definitely need this revenue because Social Security will have trouble to be financed, for example. Now, the problem is that what do you do with the revenue? And one way to use this revenue, first of all, would be to help to finance education, to finance, to help workers to adjust, to adapt to this new economy. So this is one approach. But of course, another approach is the idea to finance a minimum unconditional income. So there's a link. Personally, you can make the case that the companies will make the cost paid by the workers or paid by the consumers. But it is very controversial. It's not very clear. You cannot say that 100% of it will be borne by the workers, for example. There are very, very conflicting views on the so-called incidence of such tax. Some people say that it is so borne, some part of it will be borne by the shareholders. Some people say by the workers, other by the consumer. I don't think you can make the case saying everything will be borne by the workers. This I don't believe. But at least an unconditional income tax makes a lot of sense, and this could be a link to the robot tax. I agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat section from the professor of tax law and the dean of the faculty of law at Altınbaş University, Professor Ateş. She is asking whether we can use the basic principles of motor vehicle tax and to implement them sort of to get inspired from these principles in terms of a robot tax.
Well, yes, I think this is a starting point. And this is the approach that California has taken, for example. So the first project, the first robot tax that you see are on automatic or self-driving cars. So the approach they took is really based on the motor car principle. And if you look at their system, there's even a sort of, they can even introduce inside the tariff some kind of progressivity, or they can introduce aspects of pollution. So this is an interesting approach, but I don't think this would be suitable for every kind of the use of automation. So this is a starting point, but you could, I think personally, eventually you should try to have a more global approach on taxing robots.
Thank you. Now we have a question from the floor. Nilay Dayanç Kuzey, please.
I would like to thank Kadir Has University for this amazing organization and thank Professor Oberson for this inspiring talk. I have two main questions, and the first is similar with the second question already asked, but I would like to have your opinion if we accept robots as products or as commodities and tax the owners of the robots, who are the ones generating revenue from them. In this case, we would still taxing the revenue generated. We would still be taxing the salary saved by the person utilizing from the robots as revenue, and there won't be any revenue remained untaxed. And from the perspective of governments, yes, there won't be salaries, but there will still be income of the employer as a reflection of that salary. there will be still some people generating revenue from the robots. So my question is, why it is not sufficient to tax the person who generates revenue from the robots? And my second question is related with the legal personality of robots. In terms of assigning robots a legal personality, and in terms of applying two-layer taxation solution as you propose, I believe assigning robots legal personality will have a huge registration cost. And I would like to have your opinion on that issue as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point as well. So yes, first of all, what I suggest is because I see the point. It's not a new tax that will be added to the existing tax, because you're right, it doesn't make sense if you have, let's say, an enterprise which has the profit tax, and then you just put a tax on robot. Doesn't make sense. You need to adjust the system, first of all. That's very clear. So then we go into more details, but the point is that when an enterprise is using robots or artificial intelligence, this enterprise can amortize the cost. So you have your machine, the enterprise is paying for the machine, but then the machine will be amortized over the time, which will reduce the profit. So in fact, I made in one of my book, there's a computation, because I see absolutely your point. There's a problem here, but I made some computation, and if you take into account the amortization cost of the machine and the robotics, in fact, if you introduce a tax on robot, this would compensate for that. So it will really create additional income. And also the social security system will need to be changed, because the social security system is based on the salary as such. If you don't have any workers, I mean, any human workers anymore, you have no salary, you have no base. So the social security system goes bankrupt. I mean, very, very provocatively said. So you need to create, in my view, some kind of even theoretical salary to raise a base for the tax and for the social security tax. Now, your second point, yes, registration, that's an issue. But how many corporations do you have in your country, for example? You have thousands and thousands of corporations, and you have a registry. In Switzerland, we have what we call the Register of Commerce. Well, you have the corporation, you have the people on the boards. I agree that this will create a lot of administrative costs, but this is at least one of the idea that the EU is considering. Maybe also you should think about this from a protection perspective, because some people are very scared by artificial intelligence, and I'm thinking about prominent AI researcher would say there could be a time where we would not even be able to control what is going on there. So the idea to register or some kind of administrative supervision would be necessary, probably, I think.
We have one last question, basically two questions, but I'm going to formulate them as one in the chat section. So the first one is quite long, but I can sum it up to how do you interpret the relation between capitalism and a robot tax? Because the tax is going to make the use of robots more costly, and how this is going to translate in a capitalist world. I think after this long paragraph, I can summarize it to that. And another question, why should the states incentivize artificial intelligence? Because it will end up for people to lose their jobs. So since those questions are both linked to the state policy, I regroup them together, Professor.
Okay, sorry, Alam, can you repeat the second
one?
The second part of the question, yeah?
Yes. The second question is, isn't it a controversial attitude for the governments to incentivize artificial intelligence, because this is going to translate in loss of jobs and is going to be detrimental to the population in general,
Okay.
according to the question.
Yeah, these are very, I mean, just want to thank you very much for your question, because they are very interesting, and they raise very different perspective. And I made a lot of conferences around the world about this robot tax, and you are really putting me, it's very, I thank you very much, because you are putting me sometime to my limits, honestly. So, well, yes, capitalist system. Personally, I don't think the robot tax is against a capitalist regime at all. It's just a tax. We have a profit tax. We have an income tax. It's absolutely, it's adequate to a capitalist system, because what we do, in fact, is to define an income which doesn't exist today, but which in a way is imputed by the use of artificial intelligence. For example, in Switzerland, when we tax imputed rent, nobody will say that Switzerland doesn't respect the right of property. You have the right to own a house, you have the right to own an apartment, and you have an imputed income which corresponds to the rent that you should have paid. Now, you are an enterprise, you are replacing human workers by robots. Well, you have an imputed income which corresponds to the salary that you should have paid. You have to take into consideration, as was discussed before, maybe the expenses of the amortization of the robotics. I understand that, but I think it's absolutely compatible, if you may say, with a capitalism regime. So in other words, it can be defined in a way which corresponds to a market economy, I would say, a market economy. So maybe that would be a first response. And then the second aspect is, well, this is almost a political issue, the second question. But what I can say is that personally, I think you cannot really go against innovation. You know, if one state will say, okay, I want to stop the robotics, you can do that. But another state will do it. Everybody, all the researchers in the world right now are thinking about artificial intelligence. So I think it will be very difficult to go against this kind of wave in favor of artificial intelligence. And as I said, in some respect, it's a very good development, because it will replace dangerous jobs, boring jobs. You can even imagine, let's be a bit utopian here. You can even imagine in an economy, I don't know, in 50 or 100 years, where there's no more labor, for example. But maybe it's not so detrimental if you find a way, as we discussed, for example, with a minimum income to finance all the workers. Then maybe we can do also something else. We can focus on music. We can focus on health. We can help the people, you know. So this is then an economy which is not so much based on labor, but based on activity, but not on labor. Right? There are many economists or thinkers that are, this is not personal ideas, and I'm telling, these are ideas that some thinkers are already considering right now. So in a way, I think the policy to say we are going to try to stop or to limit this development of artificial intelligence is not probably the best approach, but on the other hand, we should find a way to control this development and to make sure that ethical aspects are respected by this machine, by artificial intelligence. And this will be, I think, the biggest challenge. So not to go against the development as such, of artificial intelligence, but also to focus on the ethical aspect. Just as an example, in one of the workshop I made, there was a researcher from Harvard University, and she showed us let's say a tool of artificial intelligence that was used in some prison in the United States. And this mechanism of artificial intelligence was used in order to say if a person could arguably benefit from a reduced time in jail, or could be even free at home as a kind of experiment. So they made a research of the effect of this artificial intelligence, and they found out that there was a bias in the system, which was always, more often detrimental to some kind of people. So, of course, it was not on purpose, but it shows that there was an ethical problem in the conception, even unconscious ethical problems in the machine, just as an example. So this is the kind of ideas and check that we need also to focus on. So not only taxing, but also make sure that this machine act in an ethical and in a proper way. This would be a very, very interesting and delicate challenge for the future, I believe.
We have one last question. Basically, we have a comment and a question based on the comment.
Yeah.
I'm going to read the comment. Robots are expensive, and the cost of buying and using them is not comparable with employing workers. With robots, we have higher efficiency and higher precision when compared to the employees. What is your comment about this fact?
Mm-hmm.
Question is.
Okay, yes, it's true. And this is why also some people are saying that the pessimists are too pessimistic, because it may take much longer, in fact, than we think. This is what some people are saying, that in fact, the development of artificial intelligence is existing, but in fact, we could be, let's say, more quiet. We can be quiet for longer than we think, because this artificial intelligence is very, very expensive, and it might take much longer than we think. Yeah, there's this perspective. But still, when you see that currently a car factory is now made of 80 to 90% by robots, all these workers have disappeared. Huh? And you can take very different areas. Some people are talking about, of course, banking, accountants also. Accounting can be very well done by a robot. It's a very technical and mechanical thing. Doing tax return, if you think about the tax world, tax returns eventually will be done automatically. So still, the impact on labor is something that we need to consider. But and the discussion of today also demonstrated that it takes time. There's a lot of difficult question and difficult aspect to take into account. That's why I think we should think about it already right now.
Thank you, Professor. I don't see any other questions or anyone raising hand. Yes, we have one last question from Professor Da. Please, Professor.
Thank you for the very nice presentation. My question is the following. You can define robots as mechanical devices coupled with some electrical and integrated circuits, that is physical ones, and doing some heavy work in industrial plants. And there is another one can be only software based, such as used in the banks and other places. So those robots made up of only software, they can do tax returns, they can do a lot of labor intensive work.
Yeah.
So how will we define those robots? How will we identify that there are robots doing those works for the companies so that we can tax?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. And the EU right now, their legal definition is, in my view, exactly what you say. is too much focused on some kind of a anthropomorphic view of a robot. And you're right, this doesn't make so much sense in the long term, because you can very well replace a robot, a machine which is walking on the street, with a computer that you don't even see, and with the same impact, even a bigger impact. This is why personally I advocate what I call a form-neutral definition of robots. And this definition should focus more on the impact on the labor market than on the form, because otherwise you can very well circumvent the aspect. I was even joking once, I was saying maybe otherwise all the robots will go to Monaco, you know. Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I don't think we have any other questions. We have one last question. Are we answering to this answer to the one last question? And then I'm going to close the floor for questions. If we can put taxes on robots, and I know Professor Oberson will be interested by this one, can we put tax on data? Is it possible?
Aha, that's an interesting question. Yes, that's also another another idea. Well, yes, this is also a very difficult one, which needs to be analyzed, because the problem is that data, for example, what is a data? And you have good data and you have spam, or you have very bad data. So how can you distinguish, for example, between the two? How can you distinguish between the content? Personally, I would really favor to tax spam. I'm sure everybody in the room would accept that. But when, under which condition it becomes a spam, or so there are a lot of things to be developed. Plus, the problem of data is that it's very provocative what I'm saying, but in a way it's like a tax from the Middle Age. It's very paradoxical. We are talking about data on computers, and we are taxing them like the Middle Age. In a way, it's like the salt tax. Remember, in the Middle Age, you had a tax called la gabelle in French. When you were crossing a land, you had to pay a tax on the salt that you were carrying with you. In a way, it's the same. You are transferring data, and when you cross certain device, you will have to pay the tax. I'm not saying we should not do that, but I'm saying there's a lot of different aspects to consider in order to have something which is appropriate.
I see that Professor Berker is raising his hand. Please, Professor.
Oh, I apologize for butting in again, but I cannot hold back. Suppose I'm a mentat. I'm using terminology from the science fiction book Dune. Or suppose I'm very good, so I can do 5 persons' work. So my company fires 4 people and gives me all the work. Or suppose in the future, I have a chip installed in me, so I'm an augmented brain. Mm-hmm. So is there going to be tax consequences of that? It's again, replacing people getting salaries.
Yeah, we have to see. Maybe you would pay only half of the tax if you are augmented. Well, this is our issue we have to tackle. But the concept as such remains valid, I think, because if you have a company building cars, and one day they fire everybody or just keep a few people, and then they don't pay salaries, they don't pay anything to the social security, and you add this to the whole economy eventually, you have to do something about that. So then there's going to be exception and issues of augmented, I agree. But this, in my view, doesn't put as such the concept as being non-valid. These are kind of exception or controversial aspect that would have to be addressed. Yeah, clearly.
I would like to thank once more Professor Oberson for his presentation and all the participants. We hope to see you again soon in another LitLab organized conference or workshop. Thank you, everyone, and I would like to close the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.